So yeah, welcome everyone to the Open Finals of BRAC University Open 2024. First of all, a big hand of applause for all the Open finalist teams. Yeah, cool. So you can so a big round of applause for It's been a competitive journey, and yeah, I hope you live up to your expectations into the finals. So even though we have the new campus, we are in the new campus, we don't have an auditorium. So all the audience members, please make sure not to make any more noise which can disturb the speeches or us as well, because you are sitting dangerously close to all of us. Yeah, pass your judgments later. So yeah, I think we should start without further delay. Prime Minister, the floor is yours.
So that a lot more people can actually have clothes prepared in the winter. But I'm here debating here. We think it's extremely important to prioritize yourself, and we're very proud of this. Here's how the speech is going to go. First, we'll go ahead and give a few setups, and we'll go on to our constructives. We have two main constructives. Firstly, as to why people lack the capacity, and therefore they should not be obligated to reduce universal suffering. And second of all, why there is no moral obligation for this to be done. Right? Firstly, let's clarify our stats. When you actually need to prioritize, right? Whenever you have a direct trade-off, whenever there's a significant amount of opportunity cost, understand that this debate will never apply to people who can probably prioritize their self-interest and at the same time actually help significantly to alleviate universal suffering. This debate is not about those people, it's about people who actually have a significant amount of opportunity cost. Secondly, what does prioritizing your self-interest look like? Here we'll be taking the highest striving ever. This is not just striving for your own fundamental basic needs like food, clothing, and safety. It's also doing things you want, your own personal desires, things that bring you joy. Secondly, what does this trade-off look like? It looks like a lot of your disposable income that you would probably spend using to go on hangouts with your friends and creating precious memories going into charity. This was like in times of disaster, instead of taking care of yourself at home during COVID, for example, going to vaccination centers, going to relief centers and helping out other people. What is the setup here then? Firstly, our verdict is not to show why alleviating universal suffering is a bad thing, because it's clearly not. It's a moral good to begin with. It's just to show why obligating yourself to reducing suffering over your obligation to yourself is inherently a bad thing. Secondly, we're in support of doing no harm, which is to say we're okay with this person not actively helping out marginalized communities, but we're at the same time fine with this person as long as this person can prioritize the self-interest, going ahead and using sustainable practices in their day-to-day lives, because that's literally not doing harm. Opposition has a specific burden to show why they reduce the harm on their side. They cannot follow the policy of doing no harm. So instead of just sustainable practices, they actually have to work actively reducing wastage. They actually have to go and participate in donations, right? Moving on to first constructive, as to why people lack the capacity. Understand the fact that the necessity is can, right? You don't have the moral obligation to save a kid in Gaza simply because you are not responsible for their suffering. So you do not have the moral obligation to go to fly to Gaza and save that kid. Understand that it's moral good. It's a nice thing to do, to feel bad for them, to want to save them, and actually actively try to do. But there's no obligation here. There's a huge difference in the two words. So your moral obligation is simply limited to things you can do. Why do you lack the capacity then? Firstly, understand the fact that all of these causes of suffering are oftentimes caused by very huge organizations, caused by multiple people. Think about climate change, for example. It's something that's accumulated over thousands of years, caused by millions of people, millions of generations. You alone were never responsible for that. Therefore, saying that you alone can probably make a huge difference is not really feasible to begin with. You lack the capacity to you alone changing the entire trajectory of climate change. Secondly, it's a collective action problem. Oftentimes, if I go ahead and tell myself to keep a packet of chips in my pocket, my mom would literally tell me, well, everyone's throwing it outside, why are you not, right? The entire collective action problem, if I alone will go ahead and try and use sustainable practices with other people who they will still enjoy themselves, I'm the only one who's making myself suffer. Therefore, you also lack the capacity from that range. Thirdly, the fact that you can never visualize the impact of this. You can probably donate to a lot of climate change organizations and try and help out people, but the fact that you can never see where your money is going and what is actually helping out, you can never visualize the literal effect of your hard-earned, where your hard-earned money is going. So it's difficult to know for you to if you can actually solve all of this. So this implies that people lack the capacity in general. What is the impact of this? You're literally making personal sacrifices. Sacrifices that are probably happening at crucial points of your life that literally change the trajectory of your entire life, but you're not able to achieve any sense of self-fulfillment. It's like trying to empty out the ocean one bucket at a time. You never reach the end of it. What you're left with is regrets for all the things you missed out, for all the memories you missed out on making with your friends. Before I move on to our second constructive, sure.
Do people enjoy the wealth that their grandfathers or their forefathers earned?
People don't necessarily think of them, a child probably using their grandfather's wealth, probably won't think that this is my grandfather's wealth they're enjoying. This is something they probably can never understand to begin with. Therefore, I have no idea what you're talking about. Moving on to our second constructive, which is about why people don't consent to the suffering and therefore they have no obligation to it to begin with, right? What is the cause of universal suffering? Threefold. Firstly, it's government failure and failure of large institutions. If you think about climate change, a lot of it is probably attributed to huge celebrities like Taylor Swift, literally taking an airplane ride just to get a snack from her fridge, right? This is the irresponsibility of a very handful of few actors in this debate who are highly irresponsible. Therefore, more of an moral obligation falls onto them. Secondly, the fact that oftentimes a lot of this is caused before you were alive. The fact that black people, a lot of them live in poverty, a lot of people in Africa live in poverty, a lot of people in Bangladesh live in poverty. It's not a direct result of your fault, but the fault of British colonizers, which is something that happened before you were alive. Even by chance, if you're a white person in this debate, you still don't have that moral obligation to begin with, because probably your forefather might not even be a part of the cabinet that necessitated, that facilitated the black slavery to begin with. Therefore, you don't have a direct culpability towards the suffering to begin with. And thirdly, the fact that you never consented to all of the suffering to begin with, right? A person generally probably doesn't wake up one day and go like, okay, I probably would want all people in Africa to suffer from poverty. Even in perfect democracy, understand the fact it's hard to express your disapproval, which is the case in USA. A lot of people are in support of Palestine, but the fact that USA is harshly against terrorism, which makes it, despite the fact that the US is probably the most perfect democracy you can probably think of in the current status quo, even if it's not perfect, you still don't have a say against it. People do not have the capacity to begin with. They don't have a hand in all of that suffering that's happening. Even in a worst case, you'll still have theocracies and autocracies who literally don't give you a say to begin with, right? If you don't consent to a suffering happening, and if you're not culpable for it happening, then you have no literal obligation to solve that suffering to begin with. More importantly, understand the fact that it literally shifts your responsibility. Governments and actual actors responsible for that act shift the responsibility onto you, because you're now taking it onto yourself. You're taking the burden of solving this problem onto your own hands. Why is that bad? Because understand the fact that governments and usually political authorities have the greatest responsibility behind facilitating all this universal suffering. And secondly, government has the greatest ability to begin with. Literally give up all of our autonomy, all of our money, and all of our freedom to governments. They have all of the resources that they can use to actually bring on visual impacts and visual changes, to actually alleviate universal suffering. You cannot. It's highly immoral for opposition to push for the fact that we should sacrifice our self-interest to bring on universal suffering, to alleviate universal suffering, which you can never do in your life, and you're always going to die with regrets. We're very proud of the folks.
Thank you, speaker, for the speech. Now, leader of the opposition, the floor is yours. Speaker, can you slow down a bit? Please.
Can they slow down the rate of the live stream? Slow motion.
After the recording is done, I think they can slow down.
The new method.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So, couple of clarifications are very much needed in this debate to actually eliminate all of their suffering. I think the debate should be happening whether the person has the capacity to actually prioritize over his self-interest and the universal suffering, and how it actually looks like. So, probably if the person doesn't have any choice, or probably has the capacity, I think the debate should not be applied to this particular person at the very first instance. How the universal suffering actually looks like, and how the person actually possesses these particular things. Three things. One, so probably if the person has the capacity to actually charity or donate, I think in particular portion, in the particular cases, you can prioritize whether you can actually prioritize your self-interest or probably elevating the universal suffering to a minimum margin. But second important thing, probably sometimes you are actually participating in the social movement, which also associated a lot of benefit to the other people. But third, a lot of the time your lifestyle are also important. So probably if you using the green technology, probably you are sacrificing your self-interest, but probably it actually help a lot of people reducing the global warming in the most instant. Three pieces of argument are coming from opening opposition. Firstly, I will tell you that why the ability of your self-interest is purely based on the randomness, how it actually looks like. So probably if what the benefit you are getting from your throughout your life, probably a lot of the time the benefit are getting from the randomness. So probably if you are living born in a privileged and wealthy family, probably you have much more access to actually enjoy your life, or the access to have more benefit throughout it. The ability to get better education, the ability to get better healthcare is largely depend on the particular thing. How it actually, why it is important? This is important because probably when you are prioritizing the self-interest, when you have the option, probably you can actually not prioritizing self-interest in that particular portion. You are actually deprioritizing this particular thing. But what is the link up? The link up is that you are getting lot of the benefit and which actually getting from the randomness, and we are not talking about. We are actually talking about in this particular thing. So the first argument that comes from opening opposition is that why the way you are actually getting the self-interest is purely based on the randomness, and we believe if it is getting from the randomness, we think it is not justified just because you are getting in randomness. Probably there might be 10 people others who can access to all these benefits. So just because you are getting to this benefit by the randomness, it is not justified in the most instance. The second argument that comes from opening opposition is that you actually don't create the suffering. I agree with this particular thing, but the problem is that you are getting benefited and which actually deprioritize them. How it actually looks like. So probably you are benefited from the generational wealth. So let's give an illustration. Probably if you are an American kid and probably if you are an American dream, probably this actually causes lot of the proxy war that actually US played in the Middle East or the years after years. All of these things prove that probably the people living in the enjoyed or probably living in a fancy life in the developed country is largely based on the cost of lot of the millions of people that suffer. So we believe the way you are getting your self-interest or prioritizing your wealthy life is significantly causing is a result of lot of people suffering in the most instant. That is the actual link up that we are talking about. If opening government or closing government wins to win debate, they have to prove that why this doesn't actually happen. But the most important thing, they don't actually, even if they don't consent all the benefit, I agree with opening government. A lot of the people don't consent. But the problem is that most of the people don't actually denounce it the benefit. So probably if I get benefit, generational wealth, if I get all the benefit, I don't denounce this particular thing. So how does this actually justified in the most instant? So let's give you much more illustration to make this particular argument bullet so that CG can actually win this debate. Probably if you look about the fast fashion industry, lot of the time you are actually getting probably the lot of products in US or European Union, which actually causes a lot of trouble in the Bangladeshi workers who actually get less salary in this particular instance. So probably in terms of prioritizing the global thing, how actually the person actually perceiving it. So probably you are actually boycotting this particular thing. Probably this will make you cost to buy the product in a much more higher prices, but this actually gives a stress that actually proving that why you are not actually harming this particular or participating not this particular alleviation. All of these things prove that why you are getting all this benefit from the randomness, and so probably even if you don't consent them, you actually not denounce them, and you are getting benefit this, and I think that is the fair metric that why it is not justified. Before going to my third argument, any POI from Koushik?
Your argument applies to rich people have no opportunity to suffer. I agree. But the vast majority of people are not rich, so your argument doesn't apply to the majority.
Well, I think that is the fear of this debate. So I don't think if people who is so much poor can afford his food, and I think you can say and tell people that you have a moral justification. I think if the fear of this motion is there, I think any opposition man can win in this debate in this particular instance. So I think the opening government actually falls in this particular trap, and if detail doesn't defend this particular thing, Koushik can win this debate in most instances. So now come to the third argument of analyzing. that how it actually looks like when you're prioritizing them, it actually directly harms them. I will give you all of this illustration. Firstly, in terms of joining the movement, so probably if you are privileged people and probably you are seeing that probably your friend coming from the black community or the LGBT community are getting backlash by the government, and probably you are prioritizing your self-interest, because probably joining the movement can actually blacklist you from the university or the government, or probably, but if you go to the movement, probably you are sacrificing your self-interest. In this particular process, if you think that probably it is justified not to joining the movement, it actually harms your friend. So probably more often you don't have choices. By not joining to this movement, it actually directly harms your friend, because probably going to this particular movement can actually leverage the social movement by most instance. But the second important thing, I think the culture of the how we actually mitigate the global warming. OG points out that probably we can see the tangible benefit in most instances. I think that is not sufficient enough. Just because you don't get the tangible benefit, that doesn't mean that you don't. It is justified not to follow the illegal or to follow the bad practice in most instances. I think it is even if you don't get the tangible benefit of your outcome directly, I think it is this is the most cases that if you know that these things are actually causing harm to some degree, I think that is a fair metric to say that is justified. So how it actually looks like? So probably most instances when we are talking about the green energy, green technology, more instances probably we are sacrificing ourselves, not using the AC or not using the private car. All of these things also create the self-interest, causing the self-interest. But the benefit that you are getting from is that probably the future generation are getting benefited throughout this. Future generation are getting the less toxic world of most of this. All of these things prove that why it is morally justified to prioritize the global south, and all of them are extremely powerful. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech. Deputy Prime Minister, the floor is yours.
Could a volunteer kindly give the chair some tea? Please act up, sir. We need to own our proud heritage of drinking tea.
This can be turned up, please. Also, principled emotions and the stress for finals are two things that don't go well. So I'm going to do the very important task of really clarifying the framework under which this debate operates. Notice crucially, the debate assumes there is a trade-off, right? That is to say, if you are somebody who's like Jeff Bezos or the child of Jeff Bezos, who's inherited millions as opening opposition asserts in their POI, then you have the ability to alleviate universal suffering, but also fulfilling all of your desires and fulfilling your individual preferences, which means the debate does not apply to you. I agree Jeff Bezos has a responsibility to alleviate universal suffering. The question is the average person, is the vast majority of people in the debate, especially because debates tend to be on the majority, have to be on majoritarian terms, do these people have the responsibility to trade off their individual obligations for the obligations to alleviate universal suffering? From opening government, we are proud to say no. I'm going to talk about two things. Firstly, do people have a greater obligation to themselves? And secondly, even if that is not true, is assigning this moral obligation the most effective way to reduce universal suffering, right? Firstly, then let's talk about whether we have a greater obligation to ourselves, right? Because notice a very simple intuition now. If I end my life and I donate all my organs to 10 other people, I can probably save 10 other lives. But no one in this panel or opposition is going to say, I have an obligation to do that. Why? Because we think the obligations we have to ourselves stops at a certain extent. There is a limit to which we owe things to other people. The question then is, to what extent does the limit exist? So my point is to prove to you then that the limit stops at reducing universal suffering. So what obligation do we really have? The first thing I posit is that we have the greatest obligation to ourselves. Why is that? Because notice that neither side of opposition or anyone in this room can ever tell me that doing good things to yourself is somehow any less or more important than doing good for other people. There is no objective way for us to figure out what an absolute moral good is, right? None of us have epistemological access to that bit of information, right? Because we cannot differentiate between two different moral frameworks, the question is, how do we then evaluate moral choices? We say allowing individuals to fulfill their autonomy is the best way to do that, right? Because we think that the only way we can approximate moral good is by letting people decide what they want with their lives. Because every single person has a different definition of happiness, right? Different definition of fulfillment. So the only way we can then decide on what an objective morally good action is one that people can consent to, i.e. fulfilling your individual preferences. So we believe then the greatest moral obligation you have is to yourself. Maybe donating to charities is a moral good. It is a nice thing to do, but we don't think then that donating to charities that alleviate universal suffering is not a moral obligation that is onto that you have. But secondly, even if you have moral obligations to others, I would posit that obligation exists to the extent in which it is proximate to you. For example, I have the moral obligation to ensure that my child does not starve. But if some child in Putuakhali starves to death, I probably don't have the moral obligation to ensure that never happened, insofar as the child is not proximate to you. They aren't close to me, and hence I don't have an obligation to them. But thirdly, notice obligation to them. What does opening opposition say in response? They give you two arguments. I'm going to respond to the worst one first. The first thing that they say is that, well, these benefits you get from universal suffering are very, very random, and hence that's immoral. Why is randomness a more immoral quality? Everything is random. The fact that I am a Bangladeshi brown male is random. Do I have a moral obligation to become somebody else? Probably not. They haven't proven why randomness, which is not a moral agent, has any level of moral values. But the better response was, well, you can benefit from universal suffering. I have three structured responses. Number one, why is this premise true in the first place? Why does the average Israeli benefit from children in Gaza dying? I don't think so. In fact, the average Israeli suffers because the Palestinian genocide is being used by the Israeli government apparatus to smoke screen the greater deficiencies of the Israeli government, the fact that they have a housing crisis, all of these things. So in fact, universal suffering is a mechanism of the elite which is used to blindside people and oppress people and prevent them from actually holding those in power accountable. Second response is that even if you to some extent benefit from suffering, what does that automatically mean? You have a moral obligation to reduce it, right? Especially because you never consented to this, right? Perhaps an Israeli person benefits from children in Gaza dying, but they never consented to this insofar as the government of Israel is an imperfect democracy that doesn't fulfill the preferences of people and also uses propaganda to coerce people into believing certain things are true. But thirdly, notice crucially that a lot of the intuitions they give you are intuitions where people are contributing to harm. I agree. If you're buying 10 different Zara t-shirts every single month because you want to look fashionable, that is bad because you're actively worsening the problem. You're actively contributing to universal suffrage, right? If you're a person who can afford to, for example, buy more expensive clothes that last longer but buy less of them and clothes that are made more sustainably, we see probably have the obligation to not do that because not doing so in that instance would probably cause moral harm. On the other hand, for somebody who can't afford anything more than a cheap Zara t-shirt, we don't see anything wrong with it insofar as you don't have the capacity to opt into the alternative, which means then all of the analysis they give from opening opposition absolutely makes no sense in this debate, right? So therefore, I've proven to you, irrespective of efficacy of this obligation in actually alleviating moral crisis, I say that there's an obligation for people to actually alleviate moral suffering. This is a priori to outcomes because even if they prove to you that maybe in some reality, universal suffering decreases, I have proven to you that by forcing moral obligations on the people and instrumentalizing them to alleviate universal suffering is a wrong in and of itself. Two wrongs do not equal a right. So by this logic, they already lost the debate. Let's say you buy none of that. Why do we think that even if it might be a mechanism to reduce universal suffering, it is not the most effective mechanism? And I don't know if this is their burden, right? Because what they're doing on their side is literally reducing bodily autonomy, one of the most important principles that exist, from which a lot of other principles stem from, right? So if I'm able to prove that other more effective alternatives to alleviate cannot stop the genocide in Gaza insofar as we don't have any capacity. We are average high schoolers. Secondly, the collective action problem, right? The fact is very difficult for groups of people to collectivize and solve issues. But more importantly, notice the more pernicious harm is that we're shifting obligation to the more important actor, the state. Notice what happens in countries like Bangladesh and Pakistan. Every single orphanage is managed by whom? The madrasas, instead of being run by the state. Which means then that this is hard for two reasons. One, because we think the state has the greatest obligation to reduce universal suffering. We literally take out every single bit of your freedom. We are consenting to being enslaved by the state, and we give them this freedom so they can protect us from harm like universal suffering. But two, they have the greatest capacity to. They have billions and trillions of dollars which they can use to stop things like poverty and hunger. For all of these reasons, we say prioritize yourself over universal suffering. I've been part of those in many cases, but this is one of them.
Noise আসতে পারে কিন্তু yeah
Yep, I thank the TPM for the amazing speech. DLO is waiting to start his speech now.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panels, debate cannot be about those individuals who don't have the ability to help other individuals. This is very important. If you are poor, you cannot help other individuals because you don't have money. You cannot trade it off because you don't have the ability to trade it off in the very first place. That means this debate is about those individuals who have the ability to trade it off in the very first place. That means this debate is about individuals who have money, who have literally resources with whom either they have to make two choices. They can use that particular resource to their own self-interest, or they can use that resource to alleviate human suffering. This is the choice that essentially assumes that this individual has some form of resource. It automatically assumes that this individual has some form of privilege. This is very important. What it means that all of the analysis given by my first speaker still stands in this house, because understandably we have proven to you two specific framings within this debate. Number one, we have proven to you that why these individuals who have the ability to trade it off more than often have been privileged because of random factors like which gender you have been born into, which family you have been born into, which society you have been raised in. All of this means that the sheer luck that you have had in your life in and of itself converts into the privileges or into your ability to have them like to trade off in the very first place. But secondly, what they try to say, they try to believe, oh look, these people of this new generation don't understand, they never consented to the suffering that their forefathers caused. Two specific responses. Number one, the reason why you have this privilege in the very first place is because your forefathers have exploited those individuals, those minorities in the very first place, whose human suffering we are talking about. This is very important to understand. If someone steals money from me and I ask that money back from his son, he has to give that money back to me because this is my money, this is something that was stolen from me. It doesn't matter when it was stolen from me, it was my right and my right was deprived. That is the moment in time we believe I have the right to get resources from that individual in the very first place. This is very important because this completely deals out and frames out opening government out of this debate. But lastly, they talked about, oh look, moral good is very subjective and we can't determine what moral good is. Two responses. Number one, this debate is happening on the context of universal suffering. Universal means probably we understand what universal suffering looks like. We probably all acknowledge, we probably come on the same term that universal suffering means someone not having the resources. Universal suffering means someone not having the financial institution to go out and help their own life. We believe this is something universal suffering we all agree on, and this is the debate we are having. But secondly, this debate was never about saving Palestinians from the war. This debate is about you in contributing to small donations, you joining in the social movements that have been happening around you. This looks like you contributing some of that money to your to different charities that involve around you. What it essentially means that this this debate is about these small contributions, because probably you could have used that money for your own self-interest, but now you are using that resource to help the vulnerable individuals within probably your own community. I don't think this debate is about the extreme benefits of taking people out of war or completely removing all of the suffering. This is why we significantly believe that contributing and donating these small things should matter, and this is something that we should do. But two important additional framing that is going to bring opening government and all the government out of this debate. Firstly, prioritizing self-interest often means that you are actively harming those individuals. This is very important. Two specific framing. Number one, we have always the thing to understand here is that probably you don't want to join social movements because this is uncomfortable for you. Probably you don't want that. Probably you have the leverage or the ability to do it. But you not joining those social movements often means that you are actively harming those individuals who could have been benefited by these social movements in the very first place. But secondly, probably you want to be comfortable in your own home, you want to use that air conditioner, but using that air conditioner means that you are actively harming those vulnerable individuals who are going to be harmed environmentally with the use of these technologies in and of itself. What it means that oftentimes you prioritizing your own self-interest means you are actively harming those individuals. That's why you have an obligation to help those individuals. That's why you have an obligation to get out of your self-interest and not harm them. This is very important contention within this debate. But two important framing. Number one, understand the resource of this world is limited. That means if you have had the privilege of using those resources, means someone else is not being able to use that resource. This is very important. What it means that just because you have had the privilege of using those resources, someone else is not using it. Hence, you have the obligation to give some of those resources back to those individuals because of the arbitrary luck, because of the random luck that you have had. But lastly, understand, as we have proven to you that you are probably we are debating from the lens of someone privileged, means that if you prioritize your own self-interest, the amount of happiness that you can get is not that great. But the amount of happiness or the amount of reduce of suffering that you can do just by not prioritizing your self-interest is far more greater than the amount of happiness you can get. Probably you can save 100 taka and get a burger and whatnot, but if you give that 100 taka to 10 beggars of your own community, those 10 beggars will be significantly helped, because the amount of help that you can do is significant. But lastly, we believe this debate is not only limited to active obligation, this debate is also extends to passive obligation. This is very important. What it means that probably when you prioritize your own self-interest, you don't necessarily have to do something. That means probably probably removing human suffering means that you actively not harming them. You actively not trying to do something that harm them. What it means? So it means eventually you using that mask. It means that you using that mask in terms of COVID and whatnot, which eventually helps the environment. This oftentimes means that you not going out there and doing something that actively helps them. What it essentially means that there's a passive obligation that also exists. That means both the government side now needs to prove that while there is not an active obligation, but also while there is not a passive obligation. That means if you own your, if you remove your own, if you don't prioritize your own self-interest, what it oftentimes means that you have an obligation to do it. Why do we exclusively win this debate? Because of two reasons. Number one, we have exclusively proven to you that why these individuals come from a privileged background and they should reduce this human suffering, but secondly, why they often benefit off of this suffering that these individuals are facing. Extremely proud.
Thank the speaker for their speech. Now to the closing house, CG member, the floor is yours.
This one is for BRAC.
debate is not only about if as the government has changed that you should not like donate to charity because you did not have the consent to do it, or rather telling about that, oh, if you don't go to social movements, world will get fucked up, and taking a heavy burden on that and never showing me how, even if I go to that, to what extent it will solve the but where I as an individual do not have the capacity to change that to that extent. I will give you two framings and then we'll deal with framing. An individual go through a lot in his life, right? Like I come from a very rural place. I come from a very rural place, right? They have to deal with things like macroeconomics, things like inflation, saving, war, politics, which that doesn't have significant power to change, right? He has seen the worst of it. Now, if he tries to change the suffering of others, it will likely the cost of one. He has to probably leave a lot of the things that he values, but secondarily, the reason people donate to charity or what in the first place, the reason people donate on the charity and what in the first place is satisfaction. I will show you a very significant extension in this way. I will show you, in our case, that OG didn't show, I can get satisfaction even in doing charity as well, that OG didn't take that burden, right? Three things I will show in this way. How? One, how for maximizing own pleasure, like how we maximize our own pleasure and satisfaction, which is the delta of this debate, but the secondary, why it is not selfish, which has a negative connotation with the word, because you have been through a lot hurdle when you try to change it and it's costed your own satisfaction. But thirdly, suffering is arbitrary and most of the causes that people suffer, something you cannot do anything about. Let's deal with all that. This is that you born in a generational way. Even if it's randomness, it is still your satisfaction. Your satisfaction has grown with the environment that you born in. Couple of things that you need to notice here. One, you had no idea where you were born. It was lottery of birth who did that to you. What that means? One, if you're in US and feel satisfied to go to a party and expensive shit, you still shouldn't feel guilty about it because you never chose your own circumstance. Because even if you didn't have to earn that money, you still had to go through a lot of personal stuff that no one in the world knows. What does that look like? You probably had a rivalry in the business that wants to take your business. But secondarily, in microeconomic perspective, you probably had to fight with your brother to get the fair share of the business or land that didn't give you because you are a woman or something like that, right? But secondarily, they said that you are actively harming individuals if you don't go to the movement. I did that, go to the movement and be on an essay, right? I didn't make the essay. I didn't make the essay in the way that it will cause pollution. Some people did it and make the world so warm that I cannot live without it. Which means it's a necessity for me right now. Which means if I don't do it, it will probably cause more harm to own myself, and I should prioritize because there are already a lot of negative factors that I have been through. I didn't make a see, pollution is causing bad things. One is killing me, so which means I should have a autonomy to choose what I do, right? But let's come to our extension. Another question of framing. You are an average human. You are in the vast majority, right? You already go through a lot of the things that I mentioned. That means you already feel bad for all the social causes. You already, to some extent, feel bad for the Palestinian genocide, right? Now the debate is, you find yourself asking, should I take a job in Wall Street, which is very profit-driven, or like Bushundara Group, but secondarily, or should I help where it is in my capacity, which I will be given which will give me satisfaction in some cases, and where, or else should I do something which will probably not do any crazy stuff that we are OGs talking about, but still will give me some satisfaction. These are two things that you have an option. Probably at one time you have one choice that will likely take some changes that you feel satisfied about. Yeah, I'm gonna buy it. And there are some stuff where it doesn't make any changes in the world, but you still will do it. It's still in your favor because it satisfies you, right? Well, so maximizing your own satisfaction is not a bad thing. You have been through a lot, you have been your own problems as struggle. People don't know your untold stories. The value judgment is clear. Should you feel guilty to do something even if it doesn't end suffering or any material value? No. But secondarily, I do debating because I like it. There is nothing bad about it. We all could save the money and donate to something else. But we thought that's better. And if sometimes I have the money to donate, I will do it. That's our extension. We give the choice. OG tells you that I will always do debating. No, I will also donate in the causes that I believe in, right? satisfaction. So debating is also giving me satisfaction, donating is also giving me satisfaction. This is why we went over OG, right? But secondarily, which is their first cause, that we need uniting people to social causes, right? The very moment you look your own interest and everyone does so, it makes people more united. How does that look like? Why do people follow God? It is not to satisfy the God or His word. Like the reason you still follow God, even if there are things that that are hand for you to do so. You know the end, even if there are things that you probably don't like, even if there are things that you probably don't align yourself, you do it because you know the end outcome is gonna be your pleasure. When you go to heaven, you get to fulfill all your desires and satisfaction and get all the benefits, right? It is literally, right? This is the reason most of the people do it. If vast majority of people feel like doing LGBTQ plus movement, climate justice, let them do it. Just like if you don't want to go to them, we believe it's a choice. We will give the choice. OG never told you. OG is the vast majority of the people who don't have the capacity. We tell you, if you are among the vast majority, you still have the choice to do it, and we want to give you, and we want to principally assure it that you have the choice. But thirdly, let's just say, when a person chooses to do anything in the world, that really does really have to be put through if you have to do anything in the world, that puts you like capitalism, like job, classes and shit. You out and the things that you probably like hanging out with your friends and watching a movie. These movies are made by Western colonizers. You and people who don't care about environmental LGBT or any universal thing, this profit likely goes to bad things. One, you still do it with your hard-earned money because you earned it with fighting with everyone to get the job. It is principally unjustified to alienate you to not to go see the movie. Because the very moment you do it, I also tell you that if the satisfaction of donating to Palestinian cause, that you always tell me that it's not connected, that I'm very satisfied when I donate to Palestinian cause, right? So very proud to propose. Here's from the BRAC.
I thank the speaker for this speech. See you remember the
Okay, put the camera down.
Are you sure?
Okay. You are now hearing Seeam Marjan. Maybe. We don't know. Could be somebody else.
And maybe the spirit of all the great debaters are in me now.
Yes.
Don't be very good speaker.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. If it was the dominant norm for every individual to prioritize their own self-interest, we wouldn't have such a good judge panel in front of us, probably because they would go to a different online tournament where they would get $80 to judge one day. We think that this debate is not an act or motion. This debate is a value judgment on what is right for the individual to do, and that individual literally applies to every single person that exists right now. 3 pieces of extension and from opposing opposition. Firstly is the idea of the conception of morality and why it is better served under our set of houses. We'll deal with the principal framework that comes from open government. Firstly, let's give governments the best case. Say that the conception of morality probably stemmed from selfish interests because in the past people wanted to survive, right? So morality was probably based on the survival and propagation of your species. We think then that human ethics is uniquely different for 2 reasons. Number 1, we think that human ethics and the morality that stems from it need to be overriding all other norms for it to be consistent, which means that everyone has different lives and needs and it's hard to find a common ground, but universal suffering is the one thing that brings people together because everyone can relate to suffering on a different level based on their myopic life, which means that, for example, for you, suffering could be going through depression in your own personal life. For someone else, suffering could mean not having food on their table, which means that regardless of how different every single individual's suffering are based on their material condition or based on their mental health and well-being, this is still one thing that every single person can relate to and agree on, which means that because morality is something that really dictates how we should act on a daily life, internal consistency and universality is extremely important and is better served in opposing opposition. Secondly, even if we don't want morality to be universal, even if it's subjective, we think that morality needs to be forward-thinking because humans are the only species to think extensively about the future and our place in the universe. Think about the Mayans who predicted the world would die in 2012. They were wrong, but they still cared about the future and were forward-thinking, right? So forward better served when you try to alleviate universal suffering because you're more likely to solve world issues like climate change, things like inflation, the threat of war because of nuclear proliferation, and all these things like social justice and whatnot, right? Which means that because individuals wanted a better life in the future, they were able to self-sacrifice themselves, and we've seen this happen throughout history. The fact that people, like young men, went to war in World War II to fight against evil because they wanted a better world is probably the greatest act of self-sacrifice that we've seen, and that has been universally thought of as extremely moral and good. But more importantly, we'd like to draw the analogy of future autonomy and why that is more important than the current autonomy that Oji would like you to believe. Because if current autonomy really was important, then every single person would probably be happy being in a glorified slave contract where you have autonomy in every single material well-being that you have right now. But you don't, because that curtails your future autonomy, because you'll always be bound by that contract to begin with. Which means if you don't act to solve universal suffering, the collective future autonomy of every single person who's going to be born into this world and have to solve all these world issues is going to be curtailed, is a far greater principle harm under the rest of the house. The reason why this argument is important is because it uniquely proves that alleviating universal suffering is the closest to an ideal conception of morality. Second piece of extension. Let's say that even if universal suffering is not the ideal conception of morality, we still think the individual owes a greater obligation to alleviating universal suffering. For example, let's talk about why the obligation to yourself and the people around you is not as great as government is likely to believe. Two reasons. Number one, personal needs are important, but not to the extent that it harms other people. That's why we have J.S. Mill's harm principle, where you're allowed to do every single thing, but not to the extent that it harms other people. That's why we have things like proportionality in the criminal justice system, where you're harmed and put in jail based on the harm that you do to other people. This is extremely important because let's talk about the vast majority of people here, middle class individuals, right? These are still people who cause unique harm to people through their consumption. When they consume things like smoking that directly contributes to harm to the people around them and the environment around them, when they do things like, for example, the fact that they're moving up the corporate ladder in a zero-sum game that uniquely causes other individuals to go down, is also significant harm that you're doing as a middle-class individual. But also the fact that a lot of middle-class individuals have problematic views and oftentimes champion those problematic views that cause unique harm to minorities and all these kinds of people means that even if you're able to act on that self-interest based on your personal interest, we don't think that you can do that to the extent that it harms other people. But also it means that, for example, middle-class individuals or working-class individuals who often become victims of crimes of acquisition also cause harms to other people. Which means that all of these other things uniquely proves that middle-class individuals still cause harm. We're not going to debate about rich people because it's probably obvious why they cause harms. Secondly, obligation to loved ones is arbitrary. You just happen to be born with those people around you. It is the level of connection you have with them that determines whether you have an obligation or not. That is why we have things like found family and why we often move away from our families if our parents are abusive, for instance. Which means, if you're trying to have obligation towards your loved ones, universal suffering better caters to them. Why do we think there's a greater obligation under our side? Number one, you directly contributed to suffering through things like colonialism, crime, to the fact that you're probably a police individual, you're acting in the police who don't act out on police brutality. Even if you're one inactive person in the system, you are still contributing to suffering on a large scale. Secondly, you indirectly benefited. The reason why this principle is important, which Owen never explained, is because we still have things like proportional taxation, where even if you work hard to earn money, you are still taxed more because you indirectly benefit from capitalism. But thirdly, sometimes you're in a unique position to help. Exclusive analysis that did not come from opening opposition. This is important because in society, we already have things like witness subpoena, where you can literally force individuals to come to court and give a witness on the fact that the trolley problem exists to begin with. Which means that there are far clearer and more direct lines of obligation that exists under our laws. Last part of our speech, as to why even if that obligation is the same or greater in OG's house, why do we think there is greater utility under our side of the house? For example, let's show you why myopic change is extremely important. For example, even if you're a middle-class individual, you probably don't have as much money, you can still cause change in 4 ways. You can change attitudes on the ground. For example, by telling your parents not to be as sexist or misogynist, to tell your sister that you can probably go and fulfill your dreams to begin with. You can probably have enough money to, for example, build a small school or madrasa in your institution that can provide education in rural areas and all these other places. You can probably control your consumption. For example, you probably don't smoke or don't litter on the street, or you probably don't consume from brands and boycott brands that actively cause harms. But fourthly, you can also push your political change, because most liberal democracies are not like the US. They're probably going to be good, and preferences are aggregated and matched by state institutions. Which means that if this becomes a norm and every single person does this, the delta of change is greater on our side of the house. But secondly, they say that institutional corporations are the ones that cause harm. Even if that is true, they're still comprised of individuals. We engage them to do better by creating a collective mass of positive change, but these individuals can also eventually attain positions of power and cause positive change in and of themselves. For all these reasons, I'm never been prouder of those.
Thank you, Speaker, for the speech.
We don't know if he gave a speech because there's no proof. Yes.
By just quoting Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels from opposition bench at the very first place. Everything you did is just quoting Karl Marx saying, oh my god, we have a lot of contributions, we have like a lot of obligations, like let's reach, turn down everything. That is something like, oh, trying to build up a Marxist utopia. That is the only thing I can think of. This Marxist utopia only think like you have pushed a very, very hard burden that every rich is obligated somehow. But how do you think that if I like turn down Jeff Bezos and take this like $6 billion and like donate it every month, does this change utility in any case? Does this change the human suffering, everything? Does this alleviate the universal suffering at the very first place? Universal suffering is something that exists from the entire dawn of humanity, and that is something is like a crazy wall. That is something you cannot break. You cannot break it. That is something that has never been changed. The more we fight, the universal suffering is still exists. But why still people fight for collective causes? Identity, that is something Alif started to defend at the very first place. Identity is something that actually made your life more existentially fruitful. Identity is something that made your life like, yes, I have some points in life. The identity is something when I cater to this identity, I feel the most satisfaction, I feel the most self-esteem. That is why in religion, when someone tries to convince you, look bro, you have to give unconditional submission to God. So you don't buy it, but when you buy the fact that in unconditional submission, you get peace, you get other type of communal benefits. This is the thing when you start submitting to religion, because this is the self-interest that matters to you most at the very first place. That is something at the individual level, and people will cater most, and we believe that is something even OG didn't cater on. In our world, identity matters most because even without any moral obligation at the very first place, you will still go to the movement. Why? Because a movement where the identity, when you see that an identity is getting hard at the very first place, when you are attached to this particular identity, you will try to do anything in your capacity. We see people sacrificing even a lot, even though they are in a most vulnerable position. They sacrifice their everything for this cause to be successful. Why? Because this identity matters to their self-interest most. Because even if at the cost of a lot of harms, they still cater to this particular interest. We believe this is something we are comparatively successful, because this marginal success gives a lot of people a lot of peace, because that is why people go for the self-interest when this identity matters to them at the very first place. Understand this, like bombing the shit out of opening house is very easy when OG told you that without moral obligation, you don't feel the necessity to do anything at the very first place. We believe that even if your moral obligation doesn't exist at the very first place, when closing opposition tries to say, oh look, you have some close proximity moral obligation, maybe the relationships that you belong to, you measure to do something at the very first place. But even if CEO's case is right, at the worst case, you don't get contribute to the abusive relationship you have, even though this relationship has put some burden in your place. So understand, in their best case scenario, or even in the worst case scenario, the societal dominant norm is much more exclusive, that if you do not cater to the universal causation, people will start blaming you. Bro, you are too much selfish. Bro, do something. This is something we believe that is the autonomy you cannot violate. Understand this. The basic question when I want to conclude the debate. First of all, the first clash. Why do we want to why do we exist? What is the point of our existence? Pleasure, nothing more. We take every action just We want pleasure. We want to avoid sufferings. We want to avoid not the universal sufferings, the individual sufferings we have. And that is why when we cater to the universal sufferings, it gives us a sense of peace. That is why we fight for it. That is why we fight for higher identity. That is why we put identities more value than the individual self, because an individual self, this is the one that gives us more peace at the very first place. So in our world, even in the people, in his worst capacity, we'll fight for everything he wants. We'll fight for, even if we fight for the self-interest, even if he fights for self-interest above, this is going to be a marginal benefit even to the goal he perceives, even to the particular entity he is trying to protect. We believe in both worlds, we are going to get all the benefits, all of the house tries to portray you. First issue. Second concern, in OG, in the clash, for any maximization of pressure driven, understand this. If if you try to feel pressure, any rich class or poor class people, like bro, look, if once you don't do this, you are going to be very selfish. Understand this. Even if people get into this level, they have undergone a lot of hardship at the very first place. Understand this. Oftentimes, when you in your world, what you do is for any type of gathering or help, you try, even if these people do not care, even if people don't have any stakes involved in it, you try to feel him a guilt. You put him in a guilt trap. And this is something we feel extremely unfair burden on these people, and that is something will be very exclusively harmful in OG side of the world. We don't want to put this guilt trap in you. Even in all side of the world, when they take the extreme burden, like, oh look, these rich people have moral arbitrarily, they are born with a lot of wealth. We believe even in a lot of wealth, you still cannot put this particular guilt trap or this particular existential pointlessness to any person, no matter whether he is rich or poor. Understand this. A person's only existential point to live is to maximize pleasure, is to avoid sufferings. If you alienate that, if you alienate this existential point from a person, you alienate a person from his one of the most will to survive at the very first place. A person only survives because he just wants to avoid sufferings at the very first place. Understand this is the most important thing.
You can mostly calculate where your money is going and how it is going to be just with the information you have. And you are still living every bit of your life with the money your family and your grandfather stole. So why should you still not be that?
Understand this, still uttering the Marxist quotes still doesn't help at the very first place. You cannot rehash your case to win any POI. Sorry. First of all, understand this. In any case, if O's case is right, oh look, you give a lot of money and okay fine, you win this debate. Understand this, even in their worst case, they cannot satisfy these rich people. Even if I am a rape victim, even if I try to avenge my rapist at the very first place, what is going to matter most? The self-interest at the very first place. I will try to make sure that the sufferings I faced at the very right now, I will try to make sure the steps I take so that I don't have to face this again. And that is why I will try to change the systematical changes, so that I will try to make sure that the systematical changes contribute that these harms I face no longer counts against me at the very first place. This is the comparative scenario, the comparative systematical changes to any oppressive system we put forward over every house is possible. So what are the benefits? We get systematical changes, we get the impact where people actually get their self-esteem, people fight for their life, even if that's a self-interest, even if people in the self-interest contribute to collective growth due to the identity issue, proud to propose.
Oh. yes, please. Sorry.
I think Abid forgot his chair.
I'm not used to this chair thing. Sorry. Cool. Let's start.
I heard a chicken, yeah. Or rooster.
Yeah.
starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, where does this debate take place and what is this debate about? This debate is fundamentally about whether it is justified to prioritize alleviating universal suffering over self-interest. Therefore, consequences are important only if they're framed from the perspective that morality is utilitarian, and only then. That's a framing that does not come from government side, therefore we're not going to buy their consequential arguments. But even if we go there, we'll show you why consequentially we're better. That's number one. Number two, we think government misframes this debate when they characterize the debate as a world where you choose to alleviate universal suffering means that you simply sacrifice your life to save 10 other lives. That's simply untrue. Why? Because to prioritize something does not mean to completely ignore something else. That's number one. But number two, if alleviating universal suffering is your end goal more or less, then you'd rather stay alive and contribute to improving lives of people over time and over generations, and not just be content with saving 10 lives. Therefore, we think there's a large mischaracterization. But third, we think, unlike what opening opposition would say, this debate relates to every single individual, whether they're Jeff Bezos or absolutely poor. No thank you. Whether they're absolutely poor. And we're going to show you how, even if you're absolutely poor, it's not your ability to create change, but rather the debate is about your moral obligation to attempt to do so or attempt to alleviate universal suffering. The first thing I'm going to talk about. Note a major clash in this debate is about personal cost and how the world is going to look like for these individuals. We think, look, you care about your family under both worlds. That's a given caveat no matter what. Under the world where you prioritize self-interest is a world where, sure, your children get a PS5 instead of a PS4. You insure your children basic commodities and goods. Eventually, you stop aspiring and stop growing because you grow complacent and you stop thinking about society. On the contrary, under our world, you aspire to contribute more. Therefore, the fundamental notion that humanity aspires to the future, aspires to grow more, and aspires to improve not only themselves, their loved ones, and by extension of loved ones, rest of humanity whom they relate to. We think that is a burden that is better fulfilled than under our world. But if we extend on that even further, we think we're more likely to have community upliftment through that. That's a bit of analysis I'll go into detail greater. But secondly, we think the hardest burden under our world is the burden of utility. We think if we're talking about utilitarian benefits, we think in a world where you attempt to overall alleviate universal suffering is a world where you is a world where fundamentally your choices are determined by the greatest net utility for society. So, if you're thinking about benefits, then the greatest net utility is more likely to be fulfilled under our world, whilst having some individual suffering. But secondly, we think utility is better fulfilled in a world where you are more fulfilled, which is that you have a greater sense of purpose. We think in a world where you prioritize self-interest is a world where you fall into a hedonistic rat race, which is a bit later, which is that your fundamental metric of happiness is whatever you can acquire in front of you, which is problematic because initially, sure, earning $10 feels like a big deal. Eventually, $100 feels like a big deal, and you don't care about $10, and eventually, $1 million even doesn't mean anything to you. So the notion of self-fulfillment is never ending because you're never fulfilled yourself. Under our world, you care about others and you're focused on a number of things. Number one, your fulfillment is simply derived from the fact that a smile from an orphan is considered priceless. It's no monetary value. Bit later. Secondly, we think the notion of self-fulfillment under our world universally applies to everyone. This is important because that means it is accessible to everyone and everyone can buy into this and derive their fulfillment from it. But number three, the metric is therefore not the rat race, so you're not constantly stuck and earning more money. Your fulfillment is the metric fundamentally is that you attempt to alleviate universal suffering, nothing more than that. So even if you fail, you know based on your moral principles, you tried. Okay, so we'll first clash with, so my speech will focus on clashes instead of like absolute argumentation. So clashing with opening government here. Opening government's fundamental case is number one, you do not have an obligation to others because A, you didn't consent to universal suffering that exists, and B, suffering is not from ability. Suffering is not from you. What are your responses to this? Number one, that you often benefit from the system. This is something that's already been elaborated by Seeam. That you exist in a system that in and of itself has been built by creating universal suffering. So, me living in Bangladesh, the benefits that I get of good infrastructure, good And this is something that uniquely Seeam introduced, so that you are in the unique position to at least try to do something. This is something that O completely never talks about. And therefore, if you're in a unique position, note, if I'm walking by a stream, I see a child who's drowning, regardless of whether I have the ability to save them or not, I have a moral obligation to do so because by fate or whatever, I was in that position. So I have the unique position. But number 3, we are at least capable of creating change. So sure, you choose to boycott a product, and that boycott doesn't result in anything. But we think also it might result in something significant. For example, after the Palestine conflict started, Starbucks has lost $12 billion in revenue simply for boycotting. So we think we can create significant change. Before I move on,
I completely agree. You have the obligation to alleviate universal suffering to some extent, but the debate, as you say, is about prioritization. But if you come to the expense of your personal interest as well, take a harder burden.
beautiful. So yeah, it doesn't come at the personal expense. Number 1, it might come at the personal expense at extreme cases. Why do we think so? We think when you choose to alleviate universal suffering, this means, I'll look for minutes. Okay, sorry. This means that instead of working for a shop which has sweatshops in Bangladesh, you probably choose to work for an alternate shop or an alternate manufacturer which does not have sweatshops in Bangladesh. And under the current world where there's increased awareness, so more and more factories are trying to move away from this practice of sweatshops, you're likely to have those alternatives. Number 1. But number 2, even if you don't have alternatives and work at a shop without sweatshops for a lower wage, you're still more likely to have a sense of self-fulfillment. So A, we're not extreme, but B, even if we're extreme, we still win that clash. Moving on. No thank you. So moving on. In terms of diverting responsibility, we don't necessarily think so. If every individual thinks that it's justified to alleviate universal suffering, we think even people who are working in the state will also think so, and therefore will also attempt to try to improve their overall livelihood. In terms of purpose of life, that OG introduces, we've already dealt with that. In terms of sacrificing your own life, we've already dealt with that. Finally, why do we take this debate over opening? We think opening's fundamental characterization of morality, which is that you have lottery of birth, therefore you should contribute. We give a better answer for morality and why you should contribute. Number 1. But number 2, in terms of consequences, we think we flesh out those consequences better. We're proud to love those. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone for such an awesome debate. Cross floor, shake hands, and